Grace had always been an intense woman, with a creative soul that overflowed in every brushstroke she placed on her canvas. She grew up in a small coastal town, where the sea and the salty breeze were her only constants, with brown eyes that reflected the calmness of the waves, dark hair that fell gently over her shoulders, and a shy smile. She radiated a soft energy, yet there was always something mysterious about her, something no one had ever fully uncovered. Since childhood, Grace had found refuge in art. Her talent was undeniable, but it also carried an invisible loneliness. While other children ran along the beach, playing without a care in the world, she spent hours sitting on a rock, watching the ocean's shifting colors, trying to capture them in her sketchbook. Her small bedroom, always messy with scattered paint tubes and brushes, was her private universe. In school, she was seen as the dreamer, the girl with paint-stained hands who always seemed distant, as if she lived in a world of her own. The town she lived in had narrow streets and wooden houses with colorful windows that contrasted with the endless blue of the sea. It was a quiet place, almost forgotten by time. The residents knew each other by name, and life followed its own rhythm, dictated by the tides and the distant sound of fishermen returning to the harbor. Despite the beauty surrounding her, Grace always felt that something inside her longed for more. She loved her town, but at the same time, she felt trapped in a routine that never changed. That was why the art gallery became her refuge. Small, discreet, yet vibrant with creativity, the place was an oasis for those who sought beauty and meaning in art. The atmosphere was inviting. Walls covered with paintings by local artists, a subtle scent of aged wood mixed with the perfume of paint, and a respectful silence broken only by the soft hum of background music. Working there was more than just a job for Grace. It was her way of existing. Every piece that passed through her hands told a story, and in some way, each painting displayed reflected a piece of herself. Lucas was a completely different presence from what Grace was used to. He was a renowned photographer who traveled the world, capturing images that seemed to hold hidden emotions. With slightly messy brown hair, a penetrating gaze, and a natural charisma, he was used to drawing attention effortlessly. But behind that confident facade, there was a restlessness that few noticed. His photographs were his way of exploring the world, and, at the same time, escaping his own emotions. From an early age, Lucas had learned to live independently. He grew up in a family that valued success above all else, where feelings were rarely discussed. His father, a strict businessman, never understood his son's passion for photography, seeing it as nothing more than a hobby with no future. Against all odds, Lucas built a brilliant career. He traveled to the most remote places, captured images that were published in prestigious magazines, but despite all the glory, an emptiness followed him. He felt that even though he had seen the entire world, he had yet to find his true home. Fate brought them face to face on a rainy afternoon when Lucas stepped into the gallery for the first time. He was in town for work, but something had drawn him to that small space filled with paintings and silent stories. When his eyes landed on a specific canvas, a vibrant sunset reflected in the churning waters of the sea, he felt something different. There was emotion in those brushstrokes, a feeling he knew well. He wanted to know who the artist behind that piece was. Grace noticed his presence before he even approached. There was something about him that unsettled her. It wasn't just his appearance or his confident posture, but the way he looked at the paintings, as if searching for something even he couldn't name. When he finally broke the silence and commented on the artwork, his voice was firm, yet carried a hint of melancholy that stirred something in Grace. Their first interaction was subtle, almost timid. Lucas wasn't the type to talk too much, and Grace wasn't the type to open up easily. But there was a connection there, a silent understanding that formed in the space between unspoken words. As the days passed, Lucas returned to the gallery more often. He said he liked the atmosphere, but the truth was, he liked Grace's presence. And although she wouldn't admit it to herself, she also found herself looking forward to his visits. The attraction between them grew, but along with it came doubts. Grace had always been cautious with her feelings. She was afraid of getting involved, of giving herself to something that might not have a future. Lucas, on the other hand, was a man used to living without roots, never staying in one place for too long. He might just be passing through, and Grace knew that if she allowed herself to feel something for him, she might end up getting hurt. But it was hard to resist. The way Lucas talked about his photographs How he saw beauty in the smallest details made Grace feel understood in a way she never had before. In return, he seemed fascinated by how she transformed emotions into colors and shapes. It was as if, somehow, their art spoke the same language, even though they were expressed in different ways. The time they spent together inside the gallery was filled with tension and complicity. Every exchanged glance felt like a silent dialogue. Lucas asked questions about her paintings, but what he really wanted to understand was Grace. He wanted to decipher the woman behind the art, to know what made her feel, what made her dream. And, without realizing it, Grace also began to want to know more about him. Each of Lucas's visits became a new chapter in something she didn't know where it would lead. But along with that closeness came fears. Grace knew Lucas wasn't the kind to stay. He traveled too much, lived a lifestyle that didn't match the stability she longed for. She fought against her own feelings, trying to convince herself that this was temporary. But every time Lucas walked into the gallery, every time he looked at her as if seeing something no one else could, it became harder to keep her walls up. Lucas, in turn, felt that something in him was changing. He had always sought movement, never allowing himself to be tied to a place or a person. But with Grace, he felt that maybe, just maybe, staying wasn't such a bad thing after all. The problem was that he also carried his own fears, his own chains from the past. He knew that if he gave himself to Grace, he would have to face his deepest insecurities. The tension between them grew, and fate seemed to toy with their emotions. The question wasn't whether there was something strong between them. That was undeniable. The real question was whether they were willing to face their fears to see where this story would take them. As the weeks passed, Lucas's presence in the gallery became a constant. He always found an excuse to stop by, a new exhibit, a piece that intrigued him, or simply the desire to talk to Grace. At first, she kept her distance, afraid that any involvement with him would be temporary, but something in the way Lucas looked at her made it harder for her barriers to hold. The first real shift happened on a rainy afternoon. The gallery was nearly empty, and Lucas stood in front of one of Grace's paintings with a contemplative look. When she approached, he commented on how the colors seemed to tell a story of longing and hope at the same time. Surprised by his perception, Grace ended up sharing something personal. That painting represented a specific day from her childhood when she had waited for her father, who never came back. Lucas didn't respond immediately, but his gaze carried a silent understanding. It was a small moment, but a significant one. A moment when Grace realized that maybe she could trust him. The following days were marked by deeper conversations. Lucas shared stories of his travels, describing distant places with a passion that made Grace feel as if she were there. In return, she spoke about her relationship with art, about how painting was her way of organizing emotions she otherwise couldn't express. Gradually, they discovered that despite their very different lives, they shared a similar restlessness, the search for something they had yet to name. Their relationship took on a more intimate tone one night when Lucas invited her for a walk on the beach. The cold wind made Grace pull her coat tighter around her, and Lucas, in an instinctive gesture, offered her his own. It was the first time Grace felt the warmth of his closeness. They sat on the sand, watching the waves roll in, and Lucas revealed something he had never told anyone before. As adventurous as his life seemed, he felt lonely. Traveling was an escape, a way to avoid forming ties that could hold him down. Grace didn't say anything, but held his hand for a brief moment, a simple gesture that spoke more than words. Their relationship deepened naturally. Lucas started to realize that with Grace, he could just be himself, without the need to maintain the facade of the adventurous photographer everyone admired. And Grace, in turn, began to let him into her world, a space that had always been hers alone. Small moments became special, like when Lucas showed up at the gallery just to watch her paint, or when he brought her coffee without her even needing to ask. Each gesture wove an invisible thread that pulled them closer together. The first kiss happened unexpectedly. It was a night when Lucas was helping Grace organize a new exhibition at the gallery. As they hung paintings and adjusted the lighting, the tension between them was palpable. At one point, when Grace took a brush from his hands, their fingers touched, and both froze. Lucas looked into her eyes, and before she could rationalize anything, he gently pulled her closer and kissed her. It was a slow kiss, full of hesitation at first, but it quickly turned into something more intense, charged with everything they felt but hadn't said until then. From that moment on, the dynamic between them changed. Grace, accustomed to solitude, felt fear mixed with the excitement of allowing herself to feel something so strong. Lucas, on the other hand, started questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. He didn't just want to pass through that town and move on. For the first time, he wanted to stay. The following days were a mix of discoveries and doubts. They spent more time together, exploring the city, sharing meals and small routines. One afternoon, Lucas took her to a hidden lookout point he had discovered while photographing. From there, they could see the entire city, with the sun setting on the horizon. He took a picture of Grace without her noticing, and when he showed her the image, she saw herself in a way she never had before. Serene, genuinely happy. It was at that moment she realized Lucas was changing something inside her. But not everything was simple. The fear of surrender still lingered between them. Grace feared that Lucas would leave and break her heart, while Lucas, so used to leaving, started wondering if he could learn to stay. They were in love, but what they would do with that feeling remained unknown. As the days passed, the relationship between Grace and Lucas seemed to grow inevitably. They were becoming more and more connected, sharing moments that felt like they transcended time. But just like the ocean in that town, which could be calm yet hide unexpected storms, there was something hidden that was beginning to surface. It was on a rainy afternoon that Grace, for the first time, felt there was something Lucas hadn't told her. He was more distant. His thoughts seemed to drift away, and even though his gestures still showed affection, something in his eyes had changed. At first, she tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just a difficult day, one of those moments when someone's past weighs more than it should. But then, the name came up. Grace was organizing some artwork in the gallery when she overheard a conversation between two clients visiting the exhibition. A man and a woman were speaking in hushed tones about Lucas, mentioning his photography and his past connections with another artist. Her name was Evelyn. Grace's heart clenched in her chest. She had never heard Lucas mention Evelyn, and from the way the words were spoken, that woman had clearly been important to him. The couple continued talking, unaware that Grace was listening. They spoke about how Evelyn and Lucas had worked together years ago, and how she still seemed to have a strong influence over him, even after all this time. The feeling that something was wrong intensified. Grace didn't want to invade Lucas's privacy, but the doubt started growing inside her. Who was Evelyn? And why had Lucas never mentioned her name? That night, as the rain pounded against her apartment windows, Grace felt the unease settle in. Lucas arrived later than usual, and there was something different about him. A subtle tension, a silence filled with thoughts he seemed unwilling to share. She didn't ask right away, trying to keep the conversation light, but her mind couldn't let go of what she had heard earlier. The following days brought more questions than answers. Lucas started disappearing for hours without explanation, and although he always returned with a smile and kind words, Grace felt that something was building between them. Then, the inevitable happened. She was at the gallery when she saw Lucas on the street, talking to a woman. Even from a distance, the connection between them was evident. The way the woman touched Lucas's arm, the way he lowered his head as he listened, everything felt too intimate. A cold shiver ran down Grace's spine. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, didn't want to assume the worst, but it was impossible to ignore the weight of that moment. That night, when Lucas appeared, she could no longer keep it to herself. "Who is Evelyn?" Her voice came out firmer than she expected. Lucas remained silent for a few moments, as if he needed to carefully choose his next words. "Someone from my past," he finally said, without looking at her. The vague answer only made Grace's unease grow. If she was just someone from his past, why did she still seem so present? She tried to continue the conversation, but Lucas seemed hesitant, as if there was something he couldn't or didn't want to say. What started as a casual discovery was quickly becoming a barrier between them. Grace felt like she was losing control of what they were building, and doubt was beginning to corrode the trust that had once seemed so solid. Lucas was still there, but at the same time, he felt further away than ever. In the days that followed, Evelyn's presence seemed to loom over Grace and Lucas's relationship, like a shadow that grew with every silent moment between them. Before, their time together was filled with lightness, with knowing glances and subtle touches that spoke more than words. Now, there was hesitation. There was distance. Grace tried to convince herself that nothing had really changed, but the doubts were always there, in the empty space that had once been filled with endless conversations and silent promises. Lucas was still present, but his gaze always seemed lost in a place she couldn't reach. The absence of answers was eating away at her. If he had nothing to hide, why did he avoid talking about Evelyn? The distance started subtly. Small details that would have gone unnoticed before now became obvious. The touch that once was spontaneous now seemed hesitant. The embrace that used to linger a little longer than necessary was now brief, almost rushed, and the moments they shared, which once felt endless, now had an early ending. Grace started to notice the emptiness in their time together. She wanted to believe it was just a phase, that this unsettling feeling would pass, but the more she tried to ignore it, the clearer it became that something had changed. Fear started to creep in, a fear she hadn't felt in years, the fear of not being enough. Nights became lonely, even when Lucas was around. There was a strange silence between them, as if they both knew something was wrong, but neither had the courage to admit it. Grace felt like she was trying to hold on to something slipping through her fingers, something that had once seemed so solid, so certain. Lucas, on the other hand, also felt the weight of this distance. He noticed the change in Grace's eyes, saw the way she was beginning to close off, building invisible walls that hadn't been there before. He wanted to tell her that nothing had changed, that she didn't need to worry, but he knew that wasn't true. The past he had tried to bury had resurfaced, and no matter how much he pretended it didn't affect him, it was impossible to ignore. The days turned into a mechanical routine, where their meetings were marked by silence and goodbyes with no promises of seeing each other again. Grace buried herself in work, trying to fill the void with the colors of her canvases, but every brushstroke felt heavy with frustration and sadness. What had once been a source of comfort was now a reflection of her unrest. Lucas, on the other hand, found refuge behind his camera. Photography, which had once been a way to capture the beauty of the world, had now become an attempt to hold on to something he felt was slipping away. But no image could bring answers. No photograph could erase the reality that he and Grace were drifting apart. The silence between them grew, and with it, the fear that the love that once felt so certain might be turning into nothing more than a memory. The tension between Grace and Lucas reached its peak on a cold night when the distance between them became unbearable. Something inevitable was about to happen, a silent confrontation they had both avoided for too long. Grace's gaze, once filled with tenderness, now carried a mix of pain and determination. She needed to understand, needed the answers Lucas seemed so reluctant to give. Lucas knew he couldn't run any longer. The weight of the past rested on his shoulders, and the shadow of Evelyn had settled between them like an invisible barrier. He saw the pain in Grace's eyes, felt her slipping further away, and it consumed him. He didn't want to lose her, but he also didn't know how to untangle the knots he had created in trying to protect what he felt. The world around them seemed frozen in time. Every movement carried meaning. Every silence spoke louder than any words ever could. The air was thick with anticipation, and Grace's unsteady breath betrayed the storm of emotions inside her. Lucas felt his heart tighten at her vulnerability, but he also knew he couldn't hide any longer. And so, he gave in. The wall he had built shattered, and the weight around him began to crumble as he revealed the truth about Evelyn. The past he had tried so hard to leave behind was now the present, and he had to face the consequences. His words came heavy, laced with memories that still haunted him. He spoke of the scars that relationship had left, of the guilt he carried, of the ghosts he had never been able to completely exorcise. Grace listened to every word intently, feeling each one cut into her soul like sharp blades. The missing pieces finally fit together, but that didn't make the pain any less. The weight of his confession hit her like a violent wave, and she realized that what hurt the most wasn't Evelyn's presence in his life, but the absence of trust Lucas had in her. The tension between them became almost tangible. The silence that followed was thick, as if the world had stopped for a moment. There was nothing left hidden between them. All the truths lay bare, raw and undeniable. The love they shared was strong, but the question hanging in the air was whether it would be enough to withstand the impact of this revelation. Lucas watched Grace with a mix of relief and fear. Now that everything was out in the open, all that remained was waiting for her reaction, but her expression gave him no immediate answers. The future they once envisioned as a shared path now stood at an uncertain crossroads. Grace felt the weight of his revelation crash over her like waves breaking violently against the rocks. Everything Lucas had said still echoed in her mind, spinning in endless loops. She knew she had to make a decision. Running away was tempting, a way to avoid more pain, but she also knew that spending her life running from her own feelings would lead nowhere. The fear was still there, whispering that keeping her distance was safer, that it was easier to be alone than to risk trusting again. But at the same time, something inside her refused to let go. The love she felt for Lucas was real, and despite all the uncertainty, she couldn't ignore it. She had to face it, just as she had faced her own fears in the past, turning insecurity into courage. The decision began to form within her, not as an impulsive choice, but as an inevitable acceptance. Grace knew that true love wasn't free of challenges. It wasn't always simple or perfect. There were open wounds between them, but there was also something deep, something that couldn't be discarded so easily. The vulnerability Lucas had shown in exposing his past, in stripping away his defenses, was something she never imagined she would see. Lucas, on the other hand, felt the uncertainty in the air. He braced himself for the worst, for the possibility that Grace would walk away forever, and the thought alone tore him apart. For the first time, he realized how much he was willing to fight for her, how he couldn't let her go without first saying everything he had kept inside. So, without any more barriers, he surrendered completely. He spoke with an open soul, with no reservations, with nothing left to hide. This wasn't about empty promises or superficial declarations. It was about raw, intense truth. He didn't just want to be with her. He needed her. Grace wasn't just a chapter in his story. She was the story, the missing piece he had always searched for. The weight of Lucas's words hung in the air, tangible and heavy. Grace felt each one, and for the first time, she allowed herself to absorb them without resistance. There were no more doubts about what he felt, nor about what she herself felt. The insecurity was still there, but now, it was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge to something greater. The decision was made. Grace would not choose fear. She would choose love, with all its imperfections, with all its uncertainties, but also with all the strength it carried. The reconciliation between Grace and Lucas didn't happen instantly, but rather in slow and meaningful steps. After the emotional storm they had faced, both needed time to absorb everything that had been said and felt. The love was still there, intact, but now it came with a deeper understanding of who they were and what they truly wanted from each other. Grace spent days reflecting on everything that had happened. She knew that simply accepting Lucas back into her life wasn't enough. She needed to be sure that she was ready to move forward without carrying the ghosts of the past. During that time, she dedicated herself more to her art, immersing herself in the brushes, as if rediscovering her own essence. And slowly, she realized that the pain and doubts that once consumed her were transforming. Her insecurity was no longer an insurmountable weight, but rather part of her journey of growth. Lucas, on the other hand, finally allowed himself to face his own loneliness. He had always sought meaning in his photographs, but now he understood that no image could capture what truly mattered. The present, the moments lived without fear. He left the past where it belonged, not as an open wound, but as a memory that helped shape who he had become. When they finally saw each other again, something was different between them. The silence was no longer filled with uncertainty, but with understanding. The weight of old doubts had given way to a stronger connection, built on honesty and acceptance. They no longer needed words to prove what they felt. It was evident in every gesture, in every exchanged glance. Grace realized that loving Lucas didn't mean losing herself, but rather sharing who she was without fear. And Lucas understood that being with Grace didn't mean carrying the past, but building something new with her. Their love wasn't perfect, but now it was real, mature, and free. Together they decided to move forward, not as two incomplete halves seeking something to fill the void, but as two souls choosing to walk side by side. Their reconciliation wasn't just a reunion, it was proof that the kind of love worth fighting for is the one that survives challenges, growing stronger with every battle overcome. The love between Grace and Lucas wasn't a perfect fairy tale, but a story shaped by hardships, conquered fears, and the courage to keep going, even when everything seemed uncertain. What was once an intense yet fragile connection had now turned into something solid and true. They learned that love isn't just about moments of passion, but about the willingness to face each other's shadows and stay, despite the storms. Grace understood that true love doesn't demand someone to erase their insecurities or fill the empty spaces within them. Loving Lucas didn't mean losing herself, but finding a way to share her essence without fear. Her art, which once carried the insecurity of being misunderstood, now flowed freely. Every brushstroke expressed not just isolated emotions, but the fullness of someone who allowed herself to live and feel. Lucas, in turn, realized that the past no longer had the power to define his choices. He no longer needed to carry the weight of memories like invisible chains. Grace had taught him that the present is where love happens, that no photograph could capture the true intensity of a feeling lived fully. He learned that love wasn't about finding someone to complete him, but about walking alongside someone who accepted him entirely. Their journey had transformed them, not just as a couple, but as individuals. There was no more fear of being who they truly were. There was no longer the fear that vulnerability would push them apart. Their love became more than just a feeling. It became a daily choice, a commitment to move forward together, no matter the challenges. Time would continue to bring new obstacles and uncertainties, but now they knew that true love wasn't measured by the absence of difficulties. It was defined by the willingness to face them together. Grace and Lucas understood that love, when authentic, isn't about perfection, but about connection, trust, and mutual growth. And so, without unrealistic promises or idealized endings, but with the certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be, they moved forward together. Not as a story about to end, but as a new chapter waiting to be written, one day at a time.